Good afternoon. My name is Man Wang. I'm the director at the Washington State China Relations Council. Thank you for joining us for a panel discussion on anti-Asian hate crimes and violence. Today's event is part 2 of our anti-Asian racism webinar series. In the first webinar on June 24th, members of the local AAPI community shared their individual and group experiences, concerns, and responses to the upsurge in violence and crimes. In today's webinar, we'll hear from local and federal officials on this topic. They'll share their views and perspectives on such violence and crimes. We hope these panel discussions will help you better understand this important issue from different perspectives. On behalf of the Council, I would like to thank the panelists for their availability and willingness to participate in today's event and look forward to an insightful discussion. Before we start, allow me to briefly introduce our organization, the Washington State China Relations Council. Founded in 1979, we are the oldest state-level organization promoting stronger commercial, trade, educational, cultural ties between Washington State and China. This event is produced by our sister organization, the Washington State China Relations Fund, a charitable nonprofit organization founded in early 2020. Its main function is to support our educational programs and local community efforts. If you'd like to know more about our organization, to partner with us, or to support us, please visit our website at www.wscrc.org or contact us directly via email or over the phone. To start, I will introduce our moderator, who will in turn introduce our panelists. Our moderator today is Nelson Zhong, a board member and longtime supporter of the council. Nelson is a partner at the Dorsey and Whitney law firm and the head of its national security group and co-head of its Asia group. He also serves on the board of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations in New York City and is an adjunct senior fellow at the East-West Center in Honolulu. Nelson is also an active member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Committee 100. During the Carter administration, Nelson served as a White House fellow and an associate attorney general at the U.S. Department of Justice. He's been deeply involved in Asian American civic and civic rights activities and causes for over 50 years. He's spent lots of time and energy working with us to make this series happen. So we greatly appreciate your support, Nelson. And now I'll turn over the program to you.
Thank you, Mon, for that very kind introduction. I want to add one correction. I did not get promoted to Assistant Attorney General, but I was a special assistant to the Attorney General. So there's a big difference between those two positions.
Sorry.
In any event, welcome, and a big thank you to all 5 of our panelists this afternoon. We're honored to have them take part in this important discussion of public issues. Let me begin with a brief introduction of each of our panelists. Adrian Diaz is the interim chief of the Seattle Police Department. He's been with the Seattle Police Department for over 20 years and has served at various times in the patrol division, the mountain bike unit, the anti-crime team, and the investigations bureau. He's also been the assistant chief of the department, heading its new collaborative policing bureau, and was deputy chief until the time of his appointment as interim chief in September of 2020. He obtained his BA in criminal justice from Central Washington University and his master's in public administration from the University of Washington. He has also been an instructor for the Washington State Criminal Justice Commission and is a longtime author and teacher in the field of criminal justice. Ryan Brewitt is joining us. He's a senior supervisory special agent in the FBI's Seattle field office and supervises the squad that handles civil rights crimes, public corruption, and transnational organized crime. He's been an FBI agent for over 15 years and has been an instructor at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. He's worked in several specialty teams in the Seattle field office, including the evidence response team and the hazardous evidence response team. You probably don't even want to ask him what that means because it sounds dangerous. He's also taught courses in witness interviewing and interrogation not only to law enforcement officers across the state of Washington, but in such diverse places overseas as Hungary, El Salvador, Kazakhstan, and Vietnam. Yesenia Manzo is a King County Deputy Prosecuting Attorney in the General Crimes Unit and is co-head of the Hate Crimes Unit in that office. She received her BS in psychology from Whitman College, and like Chief Diaz, she's a graduate of Central Washington University, where she received her MS degree in mental health counseling. Before embarking on her legal career, she worked for 10 years as a counselor serving the Spanish-speaking immigrant community and the criminal justice population. She received her JD from Seattle University Law School. David Bannock is also a King County Deputy Prosecuting Attorney in its Homicide and Violent Crimes Unit and is the other co-head of the Hate Crime Unit in that office. He's also worked previously in gun violence prevention and as part of the Regional Domestic Violence Firearms Enforcement Unit in the King County Prosecutor's Office. He holds a BA from the University of Washington and, like Yesenia, holds a JD from Seattle University Law School. Last but certainly not least, we have Yiting Wu, who was until very recently an assistant U.S. attorney in the office of the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Washington, which for those who are non-lawyers really means Seattle. She's worked as the criminal civil rights coordinator in its terrorism and violent crimes unit here in Seattle. She's been a career federal prosecutor for 27 years and has handled cases across the entire spectrum of federal law enforcement, from hate crimes to cybercrime to federal money laundering and financial fraud to transnational drug crimes. She's also been chosen by the Department of Justice to serve as the resident legal advisor overseas in the department's Overseas Prosecutorial Development and Assistance Training Program, known as OPDOT. And she is winning today's prize from the Washington State China's Relations Council for being the farthest away from us in Seattle, because she's coming to us through the internet from the Maldives in the Indian Ocean. She's recently been posted to Sri Lanka as the resident legal advisor in the OPDOT program and will be serving in her duty station in Colombo, the capital of Sri Lanka. She's already on the ground working there and was kind enough to get up at 5 a.m. local time in the Maldives to join us today. So we owe a very great debt of gratitude to Yiting as well. She is a graduate of Seattle Pacific University and has both a JD and a master's in social work from Washington University in St. Louis. So with that distinguished panel, we think we're going to have a very interesting discussion today. And I'm going to open the conversation with Chief Diaz, if I can. Chief, because you are sort of the face of local law enforcement in the largest police department in our region, could you give us kind of a snapshot or an overview of what anti-Asian crime and violence has looked like from your seat and how the local law enforcement community has been responding in our region, both at the patrol and detective division levels, and what kind of community outreach those law enforcement agencies, including yours, have had with community groups?
Yeah, thank you for having me, and I really appreciate really hitting this discussion, because I think awareness to this issue of anti-Asian, it allows us to do a lot more education to community, so we can understand the different dynamics that are going on in the community. So we know that nationally, we probably had a presidency that really kind of described a lot of things and really opened up this dialogue of seeing where hate was directed specifically into our Asian communities, and and the president's response to COVID and a variety of different other things. And so in 2019, we saw our bias crimes, hate crimes, be roughly at around 484 incidences a year in 2019. But in 2020, we just saw this huge jump into almost 800 bias instances that we were investigating. And it really did range. We saw spikes in every area of not just into LGBTQ, into our Black communities, but we saw a massive uptick in our anti-Asian, into our Asian communities, really focused on anti-Asian hate. And so as we started to look at it, we probably saw in our, specifically into like our Chinatown or international district communities, we saw, which in 2019 was maybe 9 incidences, we had up to 37 instances. And we saw specific crimes where we saw a couple that was hit in the head with, you know, a rock, and a variety of different other instances that really drew our concern to this issue. And we've made several arrests in this in bias instances and hate crimes. But one of the things that we've been doing is we put out our community service officers. They're a civilian a group of community workers that are, you know, doing all sorts of things, from handing out food, building relationships, and really understanding the resources that are in a community and being able to direct people to those resources. So community service officers were infused into many parts of our community, in the CID and Beacon Hill and a variety of different other areas where our Asian community reside. The other thing that we also did was we just finished hiring a community outreach and engagement liaison that's strictly focused on the CID area. We had one many years ago. We brought that position back. It works really specifically on public safety issues, as well as providing education in regards to bias instances, hate crime, as well as also crime prevention. And so how do you kind of prevent things that are going on? And then the other thing we also did is, because when we had specific incidences of hate or bias instances, we really want to make sure that we're out in a much more visible approach. But we started doing community roll calls. So we started having officers, you know, do their roll calls, kind of get their direction for the patrol shift, and then they would go out and connect with community businesses and organizations and just chat and talk and have conversation for the first hour of their shift, just to build a relationship. So, you know, it really hopefully was trying to engage community and really kind of understand the different dynamics that are going on. So we've done a lot to try and address it, but we still continue to see anti-Asian crime, our bias incidences occur. We still see our bias incidences really continue and not go down this year as we enter into 2021. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Right. Thank you for that macro overview. Can I take it down now to the sort of micro level? One of the most common questions that's asked within the Asian Pacific American community is, what if one of us were to see an incident occur or an attack occur? What are the most useful, safe things that a witness or a bystander can do to intervene, to help stop the incident, or to support the police, apart from picking up the phone and calling 911 to report the incident?
Yeah, so, you know, we look at it a couple of different things. You know, one of the things that just with technology, we find ourselves very routinely looking down at our phones and not paying attention to everything that's going on around us. But really, we encourage people to as they're walking in the community, to not have that phone right in front of them, to really kind of understand what's going on, because that's when you're going to see things, when you're going to see potential bias instances or hate crimes start to unfold. And so, number one, you know, we do say if it might be an incident for police to respond. So what we call delegate. So it might be calling 911. We also, you might end up what we call delegate. So we might end up, or distract, I should say, where you might actually go to what's occurring, and because it might not be an assault, it might be somebody yelling or screaming at somebody, but it might be where you distract them and say, you know, you might say, hey, I understand what's going on. I don't understand why you're doing that, and try to distract from what's going on. And we ask, if you're going to do that, know that the environment is not so volatile that there's an assault occurring. We wouldn't want you to engage into something that that you didn't feel safe. But sometimes you can distract what's going on. The other thing is you could kind of wait and be a witness and say, I'm gonna what we call delay. I'm gonna wait till watch what's going on. I'm gonna call 911. I'm gonna, identify who the person that's doing it. If they get into a vehicle, identify a vehicle and a make and model of the vehicle. And then I'm gonna check on the person after the incident has happened, because maybe it was an assault and it wasn't safe for me to engage in that confrontation. And so you have to want to make sure that you're checking on the person. And then also there's that level of direct contact to say, hey, this isn't okay. And you say, you got to stop. And there's that level of intervention, but you have to do it in a safe manner. I want to make sure that our community is safe at all times, but you have to know how the incident unfolds. You can't, if you see an assault going on, or if you see that action starting to elevate, really call 911, provide as much information as you can, kind of sit back, wait till things are calm enough where you can then be able to check on the victim or the person that was impacted by some level of violence. But one of the biggest ways of doing that is keeping your eyes open, seeing what's going on, and always having a plan of action when you're out in the community sometimes.
Thank you, Chief. Continuing along the theme of the law enforcement side, Ryan, let's bring you into the conversation here. One of the difficult things that lay people often don't understand is the distinction between local law enforcement and federal law enforcement. You are at the Bureau, sort of the face of the federal law enforcement agencies that most people think about. Could you explain how the two jurisdictions work with each other, and specifically, when does the Bureau get involved in a hate crime type incident?
Certainly, thank you. Thank you again for having me. It's a pleasure. As Nelson mentioned, the FBI is the primary federal law enforcement agency responsible for investigating hate crime incidents. So we've taken that mission very seriously since largely since the Civil Rights Act in the 60s. And it's still obviously something that we're very focused on today, in particular, because as was noted, there's certainly an uptick in these incidents nationwide and locally, both for anti-Asian and in general. So, just kind of definitionally, a hate crime is really a traditional crime. It's a homicide, it's an arson, it's an assault, with the added element of bias, right? The subject of, the defendant targeted the victim because the defendant perceived that victim to be gay or Asian or African American or Muslim. Whether or not they're correct, it doesn't matter. But that's the bias that we need to prove. So we have what we'd call concurrent jurisdiction federally with the locals in this instance, much like a bank robbery. If a bank is robbed in downtown Seattle, it's a state crime and it's also a federal crime. So it's concurrent jurisdiction. So usually we will partner with the local investigative agency to investigate that. And that's just like how we like and prefer to approach these hate crime incidents. For example, the FBI are not first responders. We're second responders at best. So SPD will get there first and be the first responders for an incident that occurs. So we will usually learn of it after the fact. The next day, perhaps, sometimes months or even years later, we'll learn about something in the paper or via other means. But ideally, we learn about it right after the fact. And what myself or some of the agents on my squad is we'll reach out to Seattle PD. We have a good working relationship with the bias crimes detective, Beth Waring with SPD, and they do a great job of tracking these incidents and responding to them. So we'll reach out and say, hey, we understand this incident happened. Could we add some value? Could we offer any investigative assistance? We can offer that, whatever's requested, even if it's not a matter that we plan to investigate fully or prosecute federally. We can provide investigative assistance to local law enforcement if requested. But ideally, we will partner with the local agency and investigate jointly, whether it takes days or weeks or months. We are looking for that element of bias, because if we can't find it, for example, in recent history, a mosque in Bellevue burned down a couple times within the last few years. So being a house of worship, there's an assumption it might be a hate crime. it might have been targeted because it was a house of worship. So we had FBI agents out there. There were ATF agents out there, partnered with Bellevue PD and fire investigators. And we conducted that investigation jointly for a week or so. It was ultimately determined that it was not targeted due to bias. It was a defendant with a mental health issue, and he just set it ablaze. So it wasn't arson, but it was not a hate crime. So at that time, the FBI just kind of bowed out, and they didn't need our investigative assistance anymore, and that matter was prosecuted as a state crime arson. But that's what we prefer to do, is partner on the investigation, and we talk. We have, as evidenced here, we have good working relationship with SPD and the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office and the U.S. Attorney's Office. So when an incident occurs, we all start talking, and we say, is this best to jointly investigate? And we will do so, if so. And then at the appropriate time, we engage the prosecutors, both federally and locally, to determine where would this best be prosecuted. And we have those conversations throughout the process. So, locally, there's a state hate crime, formerly known as malicious harassment. Federally, we have about 4 different federal statutes that are hate crime related. So it's very instance specific as to what happened, as to whether or not one or more of those federal violations will apply. But that's the reason. It's not necessarily due to the severity of an incident as to whether or not it will be prosecuted federally versus locally. It's a bit more complicated than that. But the important thing is that we collaborate well with our partners. It's not like you'll see in some bad movies from the 80s where the FBI swoops in and takes over the investigation from the locals. We like to partner with them to address them as best possible.
Thanks, Ryan. Let's again sort of zoom back a little bit and look at the larger picture. There's been a lot of discussion in the media about white supremacy movements and domestic terrorism and so forth. Is it possible to link the incidents that we're seeing in the Puget Sound area or in Washington State with those national trends and with those groups that are sort of darkly working, in collaboration with one another? And is there something that the Bureau can share with this audience about that kind of situation?
Sure. So we have, firstly, it's important to note that the FBI does not investigate groups, right? We have to be very careful not to investigate anyone for expressing First Amendment protected free speech, for example. So it's not illegal to hate, right? So it is not illegal for someone to join a group of other people to express hate beliefs. Only when, what we do investigate is activity. We investigate criminal activity. So regardless of whether someone belongs and affiliates themselves with a hate group, if that individual or group of individuals is conducting illegal activity or preparing to do so, that's of interest, of course, to law enforcement, and that is what we will investigate. So it's a little bit more complicated. The U.S. government has not recognized any domestic terrorism groups officially as terrorist organizations, like we have for some international terrorist organizations. And also, domestic terrorism is not a federal crime. It is not a federal statute that it's defined federally. It's a criminal. It's a federal crime, and it's someone committing violence or planning to commit violence in order to further a political type social ideology. So if those things are happening, we would consider that a domestic terrorism type activity. However, in and of itself, there's not a violation for domestic terrorism. The violation would need to be an underlying violation of a hate crime, for example. To better answer your question, in general, certainly nationwide, there has been a trend up in hate crimes and hate crimes done by individuals espousing white supremacy type ideology and the like. But the FBI does not track that as specifically as we do the incidents themselves and the underlying activity, if that makes sense. Did that Did that answer your question, or did I skip a
Yes,
part?
no, I think that's fine, Ryan.
Okay.
Thank you very much for that response and helping us to sort of understand the limitations of the criminal jurisdiction that the Bureau has to work on, and the distinction about not investigating groups as groups because of those First Amendment concerns. There was an earlier time when the Bureau had a slightly more expansive view, and I think most of the country is grateful that it doesn't go down that path anymore. We have now heard from the law enforcement side, both at the local and federal level. The next piece, or the next link in the chain of the criminal justice system, are the courts, and specifically the prosecutors in those courts that end up taking the evidence collected by police or law enforcement agencies in the federal government and turning those into prosecutions. So for that reason, we've invited members of the prosecutorial staffs, both at the state and federal level, to take part in today's panel. And so I'm going to turn to Yesenia first and ask, how does a King County prosecutor make a decision about when to use regular felony charges, the Class A, Class B, Class C, for felonies that are the sort of meat and potatoes of your office work, for assault, for manslaughter, for murder, versus using the rather somewhat arcane hate crime statute that's on the books in Washington State. Yesenia, do you want to take a swing at that?
Sure, thank you. So this goes to what Ryan was saying about looking at certain behavior or action and then having to prove bias. So hate crime, in the hate crime statute, it is one of the only statutes where the prosecutor has to prove motive. And that means there has to be, in the defendant's behavior or the suspect's behavior, whatever we get referred in, there has to be an indication that their behavior, their assault, for example, was motivated by some type of bias, that the suspect targeted the victim because of their race. And this is sometimes very difficult to prove, because even though we might think that there's bias, if we can't prove that there's bias, then we can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And we can't file it as a hate crime. That doesn't mean that we can't file charges against whatever behavior happened. So in the event, for example, that there is a very serious assault in the second degree against a person who is perceived as Asian in this example, but there's no indication that the person was motivated by bias, we might not charge hate crime, but we still charge assault in the second degree. And something to keep in mind that is very difficult for some to understand, even myself to wrap my head around, is that hate crime is actually not considered a crime against a person. It is a Class C felony right now. So that means it's the same, on the same level as, for example, possession of stolen vehicle. So if you have a very serious assault, let's say assault in the second degree, even though we can't file a hate crime, the crime that's going to control the level of punishment and severity is the more serious offense. So really what it comes down to is we have to have some type of proof that the person was being motivated by bias, whether it's things that they say, they're captured on video, there's witnesses that say that this person just was using a lot of racial slurs. Sometimes we can see their history on social media, things like that, but we have to have an investigation that shows that the defendant was motivated by some type of bias.
So in those instances where you do not have that kind of evidence readily at hand, but you do have the clear elements of a case to make out an assault or other similar charge, how do you go about communicating to the victim and to the community why that distinction is being drawn, or do you try?
Yes, we try. Sometimes it's very hard. It's really, we focus on validating a person's experience. Just because we can't prove something as a hate crime doesn't mean that they didn't experience an incident of hate, and it doesn't make their experience any less. So a lot of it is listening and validating and trying to explain the limitations of the law, and also taking it very seriously, whatever other charge is happening, making sure that they know that we are still pursuing some type of legal process and consequence. But sometimes explaining those limitations is difficult, although in my experience, I feel that victims do appreciate the communication.
Thanks. David, let me turn to you next and sort of ask a slightly different question. One of the difficulties that any prosecutor faces is getting good witness testimony and getting good community support behind the case that you're trying to make, and particularly in some of these incidents where you need either surveillance camera or other things like that. What sort of outreach efforts has the King County Prosecutor's Office made to try to encourage people to come forward and help gather the evidence that's necessary to support you and the police doing these cases?
Yes, thank you, Nelson, and thank you for having us speak today. It's an honor to talk about hate crimes, which is something that Yesenia and I care a lot about. It's important to recognize when talking about hate crimes that it's an underreported crime. We think of things like sexual assault and domestic violence as being underreported crimes, and it's easy to understand why, but not everybody realizes that hate crime is an underreported crime. And so what that means is that they don't all make it to us. We don't always receive all the cases and incidents that happen in our community. We've seen that both in research studies, but we've also seen it in our practice. For example, in the city of Seattle, that's where we receive most of our hate crime referrals from. And the city of Seattle is the only agency that we work with, local agency, that has a biased detective to follow up on hate crimes. We receive very few referrals from other law enforcement agencies that don't have that biased detective to do that follow-up work. So underreporting is what we have really been focused on ever since I started working on hate crimes 1.5 years ago. And we've done several things to try to address it. One of the things we're doing is we talk to members of our community about hate crimes as much as we can. What is a hate crime? Because we all think we know what a hate crime is, but it's actually not as obvious as we all might think. We've also created a hate crime outreach team, which includes 20 members of my office, of people that want to talk to the community about hate crimes and help with the underreporting problem. But I think there's things that everybody can do to fight the problem of underreporting of hate crimes. And the main thing is that if you're a victim or a witness of a hate crime, or you hear about a hate crime, is to speak about it, encourage it to be reported, encourage the person to call 911 about what happened. Even if it happened days ago or happened weeks ago, it's so important that law enforcement is called, even if you're not sure if it's a hate crime. It's so important that we get that initial response by law enforcement. And the other really important thing that we tell victims all the time is to remember what the attacker said, remember what the attacker looked like, remember all the witnesses who were around you who may have also witnessed what was said. If we don't get those pieces of evidence to put together a case that person acted with a biased motive, we may not be able to file hate crime charges. So words are really important. What someone is wearing is really important. All of the circumstances that a victim or witness can remember are so important to help fight this issue of underreporting, because we want to bring a consequence to everybody that commits one of these crimes in King County.
Thanks very much for that background, David. So let me pivot now to Yiting and bring in the federal perspective. Shortly after the terrible incident in Atlanta in March involving the 6 Asian women among the 8 victims of the shooting there, Attorney General Merrick Garland issued a very sweeping memorandum to the Department of Justice and to the law enforcement components, including the FBI. Could you talk us through a little bit, Yiting, how the federal perspective has been shaped by that directive and what in particular has happened in the Western District of Washington in the U.S. Attorney's Office here to implement that sort of policy direction from the Attorney General?
Certainly. And I also want to thank all of you for having the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Washington represented on this very distinguished panel. I'm proud that our office has a very good working relationship with every single one of our panelists. And towards the question that you pose, I want to emphasize that the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney's Office in this district in particular have been working on issues involving hate crime and bias incidents, of course, much earlier beyond the attack in Atlanta, of course. And there have been lots of efforts, dating back till when the pandemic started, when there was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment that was directed at our AAPI sisters and brothers. And we took steps even back then, we're now talking a year and a half ago, took steps back then to really ramp up our resources and our coordination with our state, local, and federal partners, and in doing outreach to our community organizations on raising awareness to those community organizations, particularly within the AAPI communities, to ensure that they understood and they were aware of the mechanisms by which they could report any of these incidents, regardless of whether they might qualify as a crime. And so I just want to give that backdrop, because it is not as though we started working this issue as a result of AG Garland's May 27th, 2021 memo. This has been a long-standing mission priority for the Department of Justice for, dating back until the 60s, if not before that, as Ryan had indicated. So just really quickly, in terms of where we got to AG Garland's memo, when President Biden took over this administration, and at his inauguration, very quickly after that, within a couple of weeks, I would say, he made a statement condemning racism, xenophobia, and intolerance against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States. This presidential memo that was issued on January 26 recognized the marked uptick in reported crimes and incidents of hate and bias against AAPIs. And in that memo, there were a number of directives detailed, including establishing a COVID-19 health equity task force under the Department of Health and Human Services, directing federal executive departments and agencies to ensure that in official actions and documents and statements, that those exhibited an understanding of the needs and challenges faced by the AAPI communities, specifically to do away with racism, xenophobia, and intolerance within those departments and agencies against AAPIs. And then leading to Attorney General Merrick Garland to have AG Garland lead an effort to establish opportunities for the state and local agencies, the AAPI communities, and community-based organizations to institute and support efforts to prevent discrimination, bullying, harassment, and hate crimes against AAPIs, and expand data collection and public reporting of such incidents. That has actually led to federal grants that were opened up in June for community organizations, individuals, police agencies, prosecution agencies, other government agencies to apply for federal grants to enhance those efforts within our communities. The Department of Justice also held a listening session on March 5th of this year with more than a dozen AAPI community groups. And then acting Deputy Attorney General John Carlin sought feedback from each of the 94 U.S. Attorney's offices. Our office in the Western District of Washington provided written feedback to the acting DAG, and referencing specifically the alarming uptick in reported incident of hate and bias incidents directed at AAPIs in Western Washington, and our express of the concern that was extremely alarming with respect to that trend, and even provided some anecdotes of information that we received from individuals in the community, as well as other police departments, along with the Seattle Police Department. And then, as you may know, in May 20th of 2021, President Biden signed into law the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act and Jabara Hayer No Hate Act. And that led to 7 days later, AG Merrick Garland's memo that provided guidance and direction, and was very broad, but it increased resources and coordination to combat hate crime and incidents, directed U.S. attorneys' offices to really create what is called district alliances, which I'm really proud to say, as Ryan has indicated, we have had here in this district for many, many years. My predecessor as the civil rights coordinator, Bruce Miyake, established that alliance a good 15 years ago, and really actually more like 20 years ago. And I took over that role when I was about 3 years ago from him. And I would say we've, some of what AG Garland's memo in terms of directing attention and resources to supporting the AAPI communities and responding to these hate incidents. I'm proud to say that our office had already been doing that, and his memo really provided us with the ability to seek additional resources on behalf of our partners out in the community, for example, through these grants, and encouraging people to apply for the grants. Restructuring in some ways the way in which our office expends prosecutorial resources and tools. And for example, we already have a civil and criminal civil rights coordinators in our office. That has been for quite some time, but kind of formalizing those roles and being able to tell our community that we have those roles in the office, providing an email address to the community that is specifically for civil rights matters, as well as a phone number, a voicemail message, a voice box where people can leave messages, provide referrals, and provide complaints. So I'm happy to go into a lot more about what the memo says, but those kind of just hit the highlights of what we have been doing in this district.
Thanks, Yu-Ting, for that really thorough summary of some of the positive aspects of the department's approach to these hate crimes and the anti-Asian violence phenomenon that we're seeing. I'd like to turn in my final question to you to a slightly different perspective on the department. In our last panel in June the 24th, a number of our community speakers noted that the anti-Asian feeling that motivates apparently some of these perpetrators is due to the appearance of Asian Americans and the obvious ethnic differences, the physiological differences that you can see instantly that there are Asian or Pacific Islanders on the street, and that they're somehow different and foreign. The Department of Justice adopted a so-called China initiative in 2018 under the Trump administration, and has really been very focused on the national security threats posed by Chinese agents and operatives in the United States. Is it possible that that effort to protect US national security is also creating in some ways a pretext for this foreignness argument and leading to some of the anti-Asian feeling that's on the street. Has that been considered by the department?
So, that's a good question. And I think it's, I can comment on it in this way. First of all, just to give you a little bit more about my background, I'm out here in Maldives as a DOJ resident legal advisor in Maldives. From 2016 to 2018, I did this role at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, in China. Okay, so we are talking about pre-Trump administration when I was stationed out in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing and served as the DOJ representative for then the Attorney General Loretta Lynch. And the concerns about the national security concerns about Chinese influence, or I would say mainland China influence, predates, what we've experienced here in Washington State and just nationally with respect to targeting of Asian Americans for hate and bias. And so I actually see a very, those are two separate issues. It doesn't necessarily mean they don't bleed into each other. I can certainly understand how and why they may be considered to bleed into each other. I will tell you that my family, I come from a family of immigrants, and as it may be obvious from my own physiological appearance on the screen, as well as my name, my parents decided, even though they'd immigrated to the U.S., I was the first in my family to be born in the United States. They gave me a Chinese name, and I have kept that Chinese name proudly. And so what we are experiencing now in the United States, what's really sad is it's what my parents experienced. We're talking 50, 60 years ago. It's what I experienced when I was growing up. There definitely has been a period of what I call silence among the AAPI communities, and in my own outreach with folks all across Western Washington, in my role as a civil rights coordinator, in my role just as an Asian American. What I have heard and what I have experienced is that many of these incidents didn't stop. They were continuing in the last 50 years. And yes, we're seeing an uptick in reporting. I don't think that necessarily means that it's happening more frequently. And that is partly because of our culture as Asian Americans or AAPIs, in that we tend not to, tell outsiders what we're experiencing, okay? And I do think because there has been more grounding of state, local, federal resources dedicated to this issue, and we're putting it at the forefront, particularly in the last year to 6 months, with the federal government putting it into the forefront of adding resources and doing more outreach. We're hearing more from our AAPI sisters and brothers about what is happening to them. And I'm not saying that there hasn't been a targeting of them. I think there clearly is, but it's not as though it wasn't happening and all of a sudden it happened. Okay, it's been it's been bubbling. There just hasn't been a reporting mechanism that I think our AAPI sisters and brothers felt comfortable using. And now that is changing. And for example, with the Department of Justice, they recently, as a result of AG Garland's memo, have now 7 different Asian languages available on our websites through the civil rights section that allows people to be able to read about what is a hate crime, what is hate speech, and what can I do to submit a complaint or a report. So I think giving language access that maybe we weren't so good at before, and giving attention to those specialized Asian languages, I think is really helpful.
Thank you very much, Yiting, for that very thorough response to that question. Nor, I think I see that we're about 10 minutes to the end of the hour. Do you want to begin the questions?
Sure,
Oh.
I think that would be a great. There's only a few in the box, so those of you that are listening, participants, please put your questions into the chat box, and we'll be glad to share them and ask them. The first question actually is one that I put forward, and that is that I used to live in Japan, and this is for Chief Diaz. I used to live in Japan, and there they have the concept of the koban, which is like the neighborhood police box. So you have the same officers that are there all the time, I think, and the neighbors get to know them. And so you develop quite a good relationship with the local police. And so I was wondering if that's kind of what's the Salem Police is trying to do in the CID, or is that concept something that's being considered? Again, I'd like to hear Chief Diaz's comments on that.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. Yes, there are many different concepts of kind of that community connection. When I usually term it as relational policing. Everything is about relationships and how we, connect with each other. So a couple of things that we have done as far as specific outreach in the CID, we put over 60 officers that work in that area through a cultural responsive training where we partnered with Wing Museum. We had discussions on anything from disparities to race and policing. And then during the day that they had that session, they would then have lunch with community members from the CID area just to get to know community members and have dialogue. And then they would go back to the training. And it allowed those officers that patrol that area to understand the community's dynamics better. So you could understand the history of Japantown and Chinatown and and Little Saigon, and understand from a different perspective by hearing it from community members that live it and understand it. So not only do we do training that's specifically focused on specific communities, but having those officers that are just stay in the patrolling environment where they can stay there for 20, 30 years. They get to know that community. They understand what's going on. And many of them will be like, so-and-so is like our mayor of, the CID or the mayor of South Park. And so you have those officers that really are connecting with people because they value that community engagement. But right now as a department, I'm focused on making the whole department focused on relational policing, how every one of our officers does that level of engagement, not just a select number of people. So it's a cultural shift that is going to take time to move it to that, but we're already starting to train our officers as of next week will be one of our first relational policing classes as well.
Great, that's great. Thank you for that answer. Do you actually have a police presence? Office or building in the CID?
We don't. We've been routinely asked about that. A part of that is sometimes it's very difficult because we were challenged with a significant staffing loss over the last year. We lost about 270 officers from January 1st of 2020 to now. And so it makes it very difficult to what they call keep up a satellite site where you're able to staff an officer at a location. So really, that's where the community roll calls were important for me to at least kind of bring out. If we couldn't have a satellite site, we wanted to at least make sure that we're doing community roll calls on a routine basis. So every couple of weeks, having officers, that's where they meet, and then that's where they get their direction from their sergeants, and then connect with the community, and then go out and start responding to 911 calls. So, we had to make some kind of improvise a little bit because of the challenge of staffing, but I think it's actually, benefited us in starting to get more officers engaged in the community.
And just a quick follow-up on that, we're aware that there's been some groups particularly in the CID that are patrol at night to protect property and ensure there aren't these hate crimes. How do you look upon those groups? Yeah,
we've actually been very supportive. I actually did a walk with the mayor and spent some time with some of the groups that are doing kind of like this community connection. We really value that. In order for us to be effective in making public safety better for everybody, you need community involvement. And, by having community members, walking and talking with each other, getting to know each other, and then creating that kind of force multiplier where you have them as a group, it allows those crimes to not, occur because no one's wanting to do it in front of people. So we're completely supportive. We want to make sure they're safe. They have whistles and they have other different things. And then they can also know that they can call 911 and have us respond as well. So.
Great, thanks. We have another question, kind of probably to the chief, but again, I'd ask all the participants if they have a comment. And that's the question is from Ryan Woot. Do law enforcement agencies have plans to kind of educate, like in the education system, he says, to explain about, I think, hate crimes? Is there anything going into the school systems or educational systems that kind of explains what a hate crime is and get people aware of them?
And I'll answer. We actually have some youth programs. So we run a summer youth academy. We run a summer youth employment where we're connecting with youth. This year, we're already have implemented, like we've already had our first youth academy session. And we do educate on not just bias and hate crimes, but we kind of give people a whole perspective about the criminal justice system. So we bring in speakers on all different topics. But one of the things that we've been doing is focusing specifically in the areas of hate crime, and then really kind of bringing a cultural perspective of it, because we've seen certain communities. I think one of the speakers or panelists had mentioned kind of the cultural hesitation to not report crime. And so we know that a couple of our communities, the Latino community, the Asian community, have this reluctancy to feel comfortable reporting crime, also reporting crime to police because of immigration issues and a variety of different other things. So it's a kind of an opportune time for us to really kind of dispel rumors and myths and really just trying to get back to getting that connection of people feeling comfortable reporting crime. So we've been doing that with youth. We haven't done it with the schools. But right now, we're trying to connect with the community centers to also provide that level of education as well.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Jerry Strobin. He just said, talking to his AAPI friends, many say they are more aware of the issue of hate crimes, but have not experienced any different issues. I guess they haven't actually experienced any issues themselves. Is maybe, as Yeting mentioned this earlier, is this kind of the majority, or is it just that people haven't reported them? He noted that he's in the Midwest, and he said perhaps it's less frequent in the Midwest.
Yeah, I do think that the geography has something to do with the number of incidents, the number of crimes and acts committed against the AAPI community. And as you know, nationally, we are hearing it's in the larger cities that these acts are being committed. Certainly San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York City, Chicago, Seattle. So we're experiencing these on a higher level than other locations. Part of it, I think, is maybe within the smaller towns, and I'm not saying that the Midwest has a ton of smaller towns, but in terms of their community, they may not be seeing it as much, which is fortunate, or experiencing it as much. It doesn't mean that it's not there. I do think it is a confluence of factors as to what is and is not being reported. I do hear about Midwest cities where folks have reported incidents against them. There is a great website, which is stopaapihate.org, that tracks data that is reported across the country. And one thing to be careful about this data, it is, self-collection, essentially, okay? So it's not going to mirror law enforcement data, which is based on only reports to law enforcement and then law enforcement reporting into the FBI national database. But I do think the stopaapi.org collection of reports and referrals and complaints gives a different perspective. And when you look at their mapping, it's occurring all across the country. And much of it is, hate speech, which is not a crime in the United States, protected by the First Amendment. So, it also tracks that as well. And it wouldn't surprise me if much of what people are experiencing is more aligned with hate speech in some of these towns in the Midwest, but not necessarily criminal acts.
Great, and I have another question has come into the chat that is similar to what you're talking about, so I'll put that up. But first of all, I'd like to say we're at 6:03, and if everyone's agreeable, we'll go till 6:10, and then we'll have a hard stop. But if you could stay a few more minutes, we'd certainly appreciate it. So the question is for the King County prosecutors, and the questioner wants to know how many hate crimes have actually been charged and how many hate crimes have actually been convicted. And the questioner says, my impression is it's difficult to charge a hate crime and even more difficult to convict one. Then, sorry, I lost it here for a second.
I can take that.
Okay, and then there's a follow-up to that. So yeah, go ahead.
Yes, and David can add whatever I missed. I just put the numbers in the chat box as far as how many have been filed. I don't have the numbers in terms of how many of those are convicted. You also have to think about how not all of these will end up pleading guilty as charged. Sometimes there's offers, so we might file a hate crime and we might reduce it down to an attempted hate crime or a misdemeanor, depending on the person's criminal history background, if they agree to substance use treatment or mental health treatment. There's all sorts of factors. So it's kind of difficult to come up with a number in terms of convictions. What I can say is that we make our best effort to file cases that we fully believe that we can prove, so that, I don't know how to word this, but we're very careful about the cases that we file, that we believe in them and that we can take them through, whether that's negotiations or end up going to trial if the person is not willing to put forth any effort in terms of rehabilitation or take accountability.
Yeah, the other thing I'd add to that too is some people hear about cases getting reduced with offers and think, oh, that means that prosecutors aren't pursuing hate crimes. There's a reason that we do that sometimes in King County that's not very obvious, and it has to do with the statute. Right now in Washington State, the only penalty for a hate crime is jail time. There's no community custody or probation. There's no mental health treatment, nothing required other than jail time. Sometimes that's just not appropriate for hate crimes that we have. We have some tools in our system to be able to come up with creative resolutions that can incentivize people to do mental health treatment, do drug treatment. We have an alternative mental health court that some hate crimes end up in, and where we can get that probation and community custody that we don't get from a felony hate crime. So those are some of the factors we think about in the way we handle hate crimes. What I can say is that they're way up in King County. 59 last year is the most we've ever filed as an office. It's hard to tease out whether that means just more hate incidents are happening, which it seems like is the case from the information we have from Seattle PD, but also more hate incidents are being reported. So we're getting at that underreporting problem. So I think we are likely to continue to see hate crimes to rise and hate crime prosecutions to rise because of increase of reporting and because of this new sort of trend we're seeing of more hate incidents happening.
Yeah, not on that issue of reporting. Yating talked about the website, the Stop Asian Hate, and then and Chief Diaz talked about the he put a note in the chat about the dashboard. So the question that came up is there a central portal where people could upload cell phone video or pictures of a hate crime scene if they have such evidence?
From our perspective, and I don't know about everything that exists out there, we don't collect evidence as prosecutors. We get evidence from law enforcement. And so we have our police officers obtain those cell phone videos from people who are willing to provide it. And so what I encourage everybody to do is if you have any evidence like that, contact the police and give it to them. It's a very common form of evidence for hate crimes that we have. and that they upload and send straight to us. As far as a central place, I know there's websites where people post stuff that's happening, and that's a really good way to get the word out about something happening, but it may not ever get to us as prosecutors if it's not given directly to law enforcement.
And so just one thing about that, because I saw that question come up a couple times directed at what can victims do or witnesses exactly do. And I know Chief Diaz mentioned like your phone and that you're always carrying your phone, and the detriment to that is you can be just oblivious to what's going on around you. But on the other side, the positive thing is you always have a camera with you. And so you always have the ability to take video, take photos, and it really helps when, if you are a witness and standing back, as Chief Diaz said, and you have evidence and you share that with law enforcement, when they give us all their evidence, that is incredibly helpful to proving our case.
Nor,
Okay.
can I ask a follow-up question to the three prosecutors here? In an age of social media with the phones that Yesenia was talking about and everybody being out there taking their own videos, does it help, hurt, or is it indifferent when those people with those videos post them to social media even before they give them to law enforcement?
I don't mind answering this one. I actually, to that question, because I have a big kind of social media presence, I've actually had cases where I've seen on Facebook, and then I've actually alerted our detectives. They had not been reported yet, and our detectives have reached out through a social media site and been able to take the report and actually start working through the case. So we prefer people just to get it reported because, I think that there's a lot of social media influence, and when you're, it allows people to get upset and kind of angry about an incident. And if they haven't reported it, we just don't know about it. But I know that we've actually investigated cases that have stemmed from a Facebook posting or some sort of social media posting. So however we get it or however we're alerted to it, that's the important part. And then it allows the prosecutors to work their case on the backside when we present it to them.
Ryan, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I don't think I have anything to add. I don't think investigatively it would negatively impact us much if we learned that a victim had previously reported a video they captured online before they gave it to us. In some respects, perhaps it could be good evidence. Like if someone we like to, especially if it happened longer ago, we like to find some evidence that they reported it to some other people shortly after it happened, because that kind of better substantiates that it did happen, that they reported it to a loved one or to some other people. So to some extent, posting it to social media could accomplish that a little bit. But yeah, I don't think it negatively impacts. Of course, we love, I'm sure as all the prosecutors will attest, we love all the evidence we can possibly get, all the pieces of the puzzle that we can assemble to best understand and prove what actually happened. So all that information is helpful.
Great. And Nelson, we have come to time. I'm going to turn it over to Mon to say good night to everyone. But before I do, there's been lots of good notes in the chat box about resources. Yeting, Chief Diaz, other people put up information about websites and other places that you can go to study this issue or to report things. So I would encourage everyone to take a look at the chat before we close out. And Mon, you opened us. You want to close tonight's session?
Sure. So thank you everyone for attending, and then thank you all the panelists for a great discussion. I've learned a lot for sure. So we will actually, because we recorded this webinar, and we'll also post it on our website and also our YouTube channel. So we'll send all of you an email with the recording link, and then you can share with your friends, colleagues, family, so to provide them with the useful information as well that we discussed today. So I guess I'll just call it a day, and then thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank
Great.
you to all
Thank
the
you, everyone.
panelists. It was a great discussion.
Yes.
Yes.